So first of all, thank you guys so much for staying. I kind of thought I'd be kind of just talking to the top table here and we just have a wee chat. So thank you very much for staying. I just have to put this down, but I'm actually on my tiptoes. I don't know if you can even see me over this, so I apologize for being small. The other thing to say is that I'm really tired because being a keynote listener, because when Mark was like, oh, come be a keynote listener, I was like, no, that sounds like nonsense. But in fact, it is... I apologize. But no, but in fact, it's actually been really interesting, and I probably have intervened more than I probably should have to kind of, so I've been kind of the spy in the room, kind of listening to your conversations going, that's very interesting. And so what I'm actually going to do is not reflect at all the discussion and put forward my own agenda. No, I'm kidding. But I am going to put forward a bit of my agenda, but also reflect on some of the emerging themes for today. So this is in 3 parts, and I only have like 15 minutes to do this, so it's going to be very short. So I've just come from a really excellent workshop on community empowerment that was led by the Edinburgh Tenants Federation, which was excellent. So well done, you guys, that was amazing. Yes, round of applause. And what was really interesting about that session was that there was some important context being given that I think is the big elephant in the room that I'm not sure we've necessarily talked about, but I think is in the back of all of our minds, and that is the ongoing economic crisis, but most importantly, the subsequent austerity measures that we're all experiencing now, but horrifically, the worst is yet to come. So yes, this is going to be a very uplifting keynote listening session. So. Sorry about that. But I do think this is really important because lest we forget, the austerity package being put forward by the Conservative government is the greatest transformation of the British welfare state since the welfare state was enacted after 1945. So what's happening now is as important as setting up of the National Health Service in 1946. And I think that's really important that we kind of always have that in the front of our minds when we're trying to talk about who we are in terms of community learning and development, what our professional identity is, what our professional action is, how do we work with and for local people. This has to be in the front of our minds because we're not free agents here. Most of us will maybe not be in jobs, or we're going to be doing jobs of 3 other people who haven't been replaced because they've been made redundant. That's actually really important. So there's a really important context here about a feeling of widespread economic insecurity, not just for ourselves as professionals, but also with the communities with whom we work. And so that's really crucial here. But of course, so that's all very upsetting and stuff, but I think it's important we have to be realists about this, right? And so I suppose we shouldn't be we should be very upset and angry and on the streets, all the rest of it. But I think what we should also note is these kinds of tough economic times generate and produce very interesting kinds of community action. And so whilst we're in really, this is a really kind of contradictory space that we're in at this very moment, because our jobs are under threat, services are being closed, and the rest of it, but at the same time, we're seeing really innovative approaches to community engagement and community participation, of which Oliver Escobar talked about quite interestingly in terms of mini publics, participatory budgeting, but then also let's not forget the development trust movement, and also social enterprises, and even asset-based community development, of which you guys know, well, maybe know that I'm kind of a fierce critic, but that's another story, All right, so let me talk a little bit about some of the emerging themes that I heard today in the context of these austere times that we're in. So one of the first things is that there is a lack of collective professional identity and status. And I think that's really interesting. It's not a critique or anything, but I think it's a recognition of where we are, that community learning and development, and I should say, I work for the University of Edinburgh. We have chosen specifically not to call our degree community learning and development because we don't think that we should let policy determine the types of education we provide. So there's a real mismatch here between our degree programs are called something, the field of practice is called something else. We have professionals, practitioners spread across a number of different sectors, the public and voluntary sectors. We have paid and unpaid workers. We have people working in health and in regeneration and in housing and all the rest of it. So of course, there's going to be a lack of collective identity as to who we are. And that matters. I mean, it's in many ways community learning development's greatest strength and greatest weakness. Because, we're in many ways, we're everywhere, but we're nowhere, right? And that's actually really important because one of the other themes that emerged from today was our inability to talk back to the state. And I think that's actually really interesting. And I think it's because we have this lack of a coherent focus as to what this profession is. So I was saying, so yes, I'm American, but I've lived here for a really long time. And it's like, as soon as I stepped off the plane, I was kind of assailed by people going, what are we? Tell us who we are. So this is not anything new, but it's something, I find it interesting. For as long as I've been here, we're having the same conversation. And so there's something not quite right here, because our inability to name with confidence what the profession is, what the professional boundaries are, what our identity is, it inhibits our ability to advocate in the self-interest of the profession, right? And I think that's actually really important, that yes, part of our job, and I'm going to talk about this, is working with and for local people, but if we're worried about working conditions, if we're worried about cuts to services, if we're worried about all of those things, the only way that we can actually make a change is if we actually have a clear sense of professional identity and professional action, and also really thinking seriously about what our professional interests are. And I think what's really interesting, so I guess I have a couple of kind of questions to leave you with, at least for this particular kind of theme, and that's really about, well, who are we as a profession? And I'm wondering, I'm looking at the Standards Council characters over here to my left, this is my left, you're right, no wait, anyway, these people over here, to say, well, what is the role of the Standards Council in representing the self-interest of the profession, which is quite distinct from the self-interest and competing interests of local people on the ground. So I think that's important, that we don't muddy those two things, but also we don't get embarrassed about saying there are things that we actually want to achieve as a profession. So I think that's something that's quite important. And I suppose there's another question here about what kinds of politics do we represent? And also, and how do we defend and support our particular professional interests? And so, I don't know if you guys necessarily want to hear this, so apologies. I'm not necessarily a big fan of the competency framework. I think it's maybe a bit too instrumental. People kind of run through them as a tick box measure and all the rest of it. I actually think before we talk about competency, we have to talk about politics. And so Oliver was talking about, the importance of political work. And this is not necessarily about being partisan, but in my workshop on community empowerment, one of our colleagues was talking about we actually need to name and say the word social justice. We have to have that as the heart of what we do. She also said we have to take seriously and talk about issues of equality. And yes, that is diffused across the competency framework, but I think there's something important about naming politically who we are and what we do. So that's kind of two things. The other thing is, I think there's a responsibility of the Standards Council, of course, to kind of represent the professional interests, but I think there's also a responsibility for us as members, although I don't actually think I'm registered, so how embarrassing for me. But anyway, I'll get on that. But is how do we, I know, so sorry. So anyway, so I suppose there's also an issue here about how do we occupy the Standards Council. So I think there's something about, yes, Marion and Ashley and Mark and kind of all the other characters, colleagues are here and have a job to do, but I think there's also, the onus is also on us to say, well, how do we get more involved and better involved? And they actually haven't paid me to say this, by the way, so that the Standard Council works better for us and in our interests. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about, okay, so if we have one issue here about kind of naming and not being ashamed of our particular professional self-interest, there's also something here about how can we be better and more effective advocates with and for local people. And I do think it's important that we make sure that we distinguish those two things. And so, one of the key themes today, and I actually had a run-in with someone about this, was, we kind of focus on kind of confidence building. And it's like the only way that people can get involved is first we have to build their confidence. Maybe, yes, perhaps. Perhaps. But I think this is the point that Anastasia was making about saying if we only stay in the realm of personal development, we never move on to talk about how can we talk about working with local people to articulate, debate, and take action on collective community concerns. That has to be part of what we do if we really want to think of ourselves as, well, someone said kind of knowledge brokers, intermediaries, advocates, whatever you want to call us. I think that's quite important to say we have to move beyond kind of an individualized personal development agenda. We have plenty of examples in the anti-poverty, the children's rights, and in the housing sector of where of our kind of colleagues, well, many people will be working in this field, but also identify as CLD. But really, these are quite particular fields who are doing this kinds of work, who are effective advocates. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from the allied professions on this. But also, and I think this is something crucial that we have to remember from Oliver's talk as well, is that we need to think about how we can be good advocates, and I think we need to heed Oliver's warning about kind of over consulting and kind of over participation in that way, because it sounds contradictory, but I think it's important that we have to kind of resist the churn to always force engagement and participation on low stakes issues. You know, the lesson from the independence referendum, the lesson from Jeremy Corbyn, Podemos, Syriza, you look across of why and how have citizens been engaged and activated? It's because there are real issues at stake. And so I think there's something here that if we kind of consult on everything, then just about everything becomes meaningless. And so there's some sort of responsibility we have to say, look, this is perhaps not as important. Do we really need to go through this whole kind of song and dance? And that way we can stay focused on issues that are meaningful, and then we can have some sort of kind of authentic participation and engagement that also keeps a critical edge. Okay, one last thing, and this is like me pushing my agenda, but whatever. It's really hot up here, by the way. Are you guys like, oh God. I was saying to someone earlier, I was like, oh my God, I'm going through early menopause, and they're like, actually, you just need to stand next to a window. I was like, all right. Okay, so right, I know. I'm here all week, folks. All right, okay. All right, so my last point then is really, and I was kind of coming through on the train, I live in Glasgow, just thinking about this, and I think maybe some of the ways that we can resolve some of these issues about, you know, thinking about what our professional self-interests are, advocating with and on behalf of local people, talking back to the state, holding the Standards Council to account, but also being actively participating within the Standard Council spaces, is maybe thinking more critically about developing a particular kinds of politics that really speaks to our interests, but also our practice areas. And so I'm kind of working on this, I'm kind of thinking this through at the moment, and I'm talking about, I'm naming this as a politics for social welfare. So a politics for social welfare. And I think that's important because when we talk about an idea of a politics for social welfare, what we're seeking to do is be clear-sighted about understanding the nature of social problems at this moment in time. I think it's really important that when we look at, you know, what are the drivers of poverty and inequality, and why we're in this state of unprecedented budget cuts, is not because of an overspending, overweening welfare state. Lest we forget. I think that's actually quite important to say that whatever our concerns are about the state and how domineering it can be, the state is also an arbiter for rights and for social welfare services. And that was something that came out very strongly in the community empowerment workshop that we can't forget. So there's something here about the need for us to not just defend the state uncritically. We have to be critics of the state, but we also have to defend this idea of social welfare. And so social welfare is not just simply social services, you know, local services, which is actually really important, but it's actually the practice of social solidarity. I think that's really crucial, that embedded within this idea of social welfare is this idea that of linked fate. That, you know, we all don't get, you know, I don't get free unless we all get free. And that's something that's really crucial. But then also it's this idea of saying that we make a commitment to each other to struggle for economic security for all so everyone can be active citizens, active participants in building democracy. I think that's really crucial. And I think what's important is that we recognize that CLD, whatever you want to call yourself, community education, CLD, youth workers, all the rest of it, we are all social welfare professionals. And so part of our job is to support the self-determination of local people for equality and social justice. And I know you're like, oh my God, how do you do that? That's all fancy. Or maybe not, you're like, yes, more of that please, whatever. But I think what's important is that we have to recognize that we can't do this alone, that there's work to be done about how do we work with other social welfare professionals? How do we work with teachers? How do we work with social workers? How can we work with all these different allied professionals in order to plan and deliver services that are democratic, that actually meet community interests and needs, but then also to defend and legitimize those services? That they don't always support, they don't always support dependency, and we don't need to kind of support this narrative that the state is bad and local services are bad. There's something important here, because we actually cut our own throats by buying into that rhetoric, I think. So there's a job to be done here about building broad coalitions across different professions, but also across activists and volunteers to say social welfare is important and social welfare is at the heart of what we do, because if we're serious about social justice and equality, a lot of that is linked to an idea of social solidarity. So, thank you.